Hi ladies. I want to start first by talking about the next couple of weeks. So first of all, you have an outline due this week. This has to be a keyword outline. And in this week's module, and it's the folder for this week, you can find some samples and a link to Purdue OWL that can also give you some advice on writing this keyword outline. You should outline the intro, the body, the conclusion, and then eventually you'll use this outline when you write the research paper that's due later in the semester. Also, this will be my last video for a couple weeks because next week you just have the midterm. For the midterm exam, you'll have 50 questions, you'll have an hour and a half, multiple choice, just like you're used to, and it will cover everything that you've studied so far. So make sure you study your notes first before you start, because again, it will be timed, and once it starts, you have to, finish it. Also, after that, after the midterm, the next week after that, you have nothing due because you'll be on your fall break. Okay. So I'll try to keep my comments a little bit shortened this week, but you do have several chapters that you're reading. And in the first chapter, it's kind of still the Crusades are happening, and it talks about several different religious orders. I think most importantly are the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and especially the Franciscans. St. Francis of Assisi is a really important saint. His feast day is this week. But he basically was pretty wealthy, and he one time was in a church, an old rundown church, and he heard God telling him, "Build my church." So at first he took it very literally, and he used some of his family money to build this church. And his father was very angry at him because he didn't get permission first. And so several different legendary stories about it, but in one, the father takes Francis to court to sue him for the money. And at one point, Francis gets so upset that he strips down naked and walks out of the courtroom and takes on this total life of absolute poverty. The Dominicans were like that too, where they preached that you couldn't own anything and you just had to rely on the kindness of strangers. Those are a couple of the orders you'll read about more. Chapter 14 kind of also goes into an example of when papal power was at its height, and then an example where it wasn't very effective. So Pope Innocent III was the pope that it will first talk about as being very successful, and under his leadership, there was one council in particular, the Fourth Lateran Council, and there they set the requirements that all Catholics should receive communion once a year and go to reconciliation once a year. They also formalized the teaching about transubstantiation. This is the Catholic belief that at the consecration of the Eucharist, the bread and the wine turn into the body and blood of Jesus and are forever changed. St. Boniface VIII is the pope that it will talk about as not a great example, where he was pretty ineffective and the people really preferred the king to the pope. But there's other religious orders that it will talk about, and it will also go into the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. So for a long time, this word sacrament, which really refers to like a sacred event, a moment that helps us realize the presence of God, and through really visible, tangible things helps you understand some real intangible things about God. And for the first 13 centuries, people really debated how many sacraments there were, and some people thought there were like 300, but we finally settle on 7 of them, so the book will go over those 7 sacraments. Also, we'll talk about what developed in the church as a practice to pray to the saints and Mary, and this is not worshiping the saints or Mary, but rather asking them to intercede on our behalf and be kind of middle people between God and us, and so that's explained in that chapter. Chapter 15 is all about St. Thomas Aquinas and his great influence. It will go into some detail about the people who influenced him first, and then scholasticism, which was a movement in the church that really tried to wed reason and religion, faith and reason, logic, and what our heart tells us. And so it's a really useful and important movement in the church, and St. Thomas Aquinas is the most important of the theologians of that time. Basically, he wanted to be a monk, and his father wanted him to join the Benedictine order. They were pretty affluential and important in the eyes of people at the time. But Thomas Aquinas wanted to join the Dominicans, who I referred to already. And so his brother basically kidnapped him for a year, and the family tried to convince him to join the Benedictines, but he escaped and did join the Dominicans. And at first people thought he wasn't very smart. They called him the dumb ox. But eventually his intelligence became very obvious, and in particular through something he wrote that was called the Summa Theologica. And so the chapter will explain the piece of writing, and not just that, but the kind of arguments that were used in the writing, which, are kind of like geometric proofs today, sort of if-then sort of statements that Thomas Aquinas would say, if you believe this, then this would be true. So obviously that's not true. Or he would use kind of a proof to defend his teachings, and it always used logic and reason, but he used that to argue matters of faith. And so his writings are really important. Also, there was a person named William of Ockham, and he preached something called nominalism, which kind of happened around the same time as scholasticism. And this was kind of a belief that everything dealt with the individual person or individual things, and there are no absolutes or universal truths. And really that kind of combats some of what scholasticism tried to argue, as well as Thomas Aquinas. There's also a kind of embarrassing moment in the church history that you'll read about. But basically there was a French pope. Most of the popes were Italian, as you can imagine, with Rome being in Italy. But they elected a French pope, and he moved the papacy to Avignon, France. And then the next 7 popes were also there in Avignon. And so this really disturbed most of the church, especially everyone outside of France. So eventually the Italians elected a second pope that was kind of concurrently the pope as the French pope. And then they called a church council to try to resolve this. And of course their solution is to pick a third pope. And they also tried to pass a rule called conciliarism, which said that what is decided at a council overrides what a pope says. Even though they did pass that at the council, it really didn't stick. And eventually they did pick a third, the third pope eventually became the pope, and that was Martin V. They sometimes, in your book, it calls that the Great Schism. I think it's better or more accurate to call it the Papal Schism, so it's not to be confused with the schism when the Christian church split into two, with the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Another really important thing that just affected all of society, but in particular, as you're reading about it, the church, is the Black Death. And this basically killed a third of all people in Europe. And so everyone knew someone who died, and this really caused people to question their own mortality. And it led to a lot of sadness, which eventually led to some real rebirth in the arts, which you'll read about next with the Renaissance. One kind of thing that was interesting at the time is there were several saints who are what we call mystics, and they had these really mystical experiences. You'll read about 2 of them. One of them is St. Catherine of Siena, the other Julian of Norwich. St. Catherine of Siena in particular I think is really important. She is a female doctor of the church. And one thing she did in particular is that she was very disturbed about the papacy being in France, and she wrote letters to the Pope and met with the Pope trying to convince him to move the papacy back to Rome. And it was after her death that happened, but people credit her prayers and her kind of perseverance with that issue to the papacy being returned back to Rome. So I hope you enjoy the reading this week. Again, the one assignment is the outline, and next week you have the midterm, and the week after that you have your fall break, and so I won't be making videos for the next 2 weeks. So I'll see you in a few weeks. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy the break.